I think the kinds of questions that Plato raises, the kinds of situations he puts his characters, if you will, in the dialogues are interesting. When I look at the Republic, which everybody takes as sort of Plato's statement of political philosophy, I don't really see a guy who's sort of pounding home a kind of this is the way the world ought to look. I think what he's doing is he's taking his interlocutors and he's working their questions in a certain kind of direction and according to a certain logic that they themselves have sort of set up by the answers to Socrates' questions. It doesn't follow from that we've got Plato. In fact, I don't think you do have Plato. If you want to put Plato's political theory together, you'd have to read the Republic with the statesmen, with the laws, and try to come up with something like that to get even close, it seems to me. So, to me, Plato's just a guy interested in philosophical questions who uses Socrates as a vehicle to draw out the logic of some of those questions with his interlocutors. No doubt Plato had positions. I don't mean to pretend that he didn't. I'm just never always sure that I know what they are, and when I read the dialogues, I find them more nuanced than any position I give Plato, so I just tend to enjoy it for that reason and spend less time worrying about is this Plato's view on X or what's really going on philosophically here. That's what interests me more. Well, the Shaftesbury-Smith connection I find pretty interesting. There's a certain biographical thing here for me personally, because one of the first philosophic books in Adam Smith in a long time was Charles Griswold's book on Smith, and he and I were close friends, and I was planning to write a book on Smith, and he said, well, I'm doing mine, and he said, why don't you work on Shaftesbury? And I said, okay, I guess I'll go somewhere else if you're almost finished with yours. So I started working on Shaftesbury, and I think the 18th century has a lot of the same sort of quandaries we're finding in the 20th century. This sort of virtue ethics versus deontological versus consequential. So I think all that's going on in the 18th century as well. So to me, it seems contemporary to read some of these authors, and Shaftesbury, to me, at least on my interpretation, representing the kind of classical view of what ethics and human life is like. Smith being more modern. Of course, we can't leave Hume out of the picture, but I've spent less time with Hume on that. The sort of questioning of what's the nature of modernity, I find at the very forefront of the consciousness of the 18th century thinkers. Is modernity a good thing, a bad thing? What's it going to mean for us? How's it going to change us? All these things. The rise of commerce, of course, has an interest to me because of the liberalism issue and the relationship between commercial societies and liberal orders. So I find a lot in the 18th century that's of interest to me philosophically. Yeah, I mean, personally on me, Ayn Rand has had a strong influence on my thinking and my work. Of course, again, Doug and I edited a book on Rand's philosophy many years ago. We both have spent time reading her and trying to process her thought and having our own reactions to things. So I would certainly put her in the category. And some of the later Wittgenstein I've also enjoyed to some extent, but most of my professional work has still been spent in the history of thought prior to the 20th century. Rand too is. There's a kind of continuum for me, I think, from Aristotle through Rand about the question, and if I could boil it down to one single word, the word would be integrity. What's it like to have your life together? And Rand is somebody, I think, worried about that issue in many ways, like Aristotle is, at least when it comes to ethics. And I would put Spinoza and other people in that same category. So I guess there is a kind of common thread to my own interests, at least when it comes to ethics, about what does an integrated life look like? What's the role of intelligence in life? And Rand was really one of the first writers maybe because she was popular, so it was easy for me to start with novels as opposed to straight philosophy, sort of saying, look, it's important to think about your life. It's not just important to sort of go along and haphazardly try to do what other people tell you to do and so forth. So that kind of thing had an important influence on me, and I still think does in many ways. I don't take a lot. I'm not an expert in the later Wittgenstein, but I thought his move to a more nuanced and, I don't know if you will, life-focused basis of doing philosophy, somewhat commonsensical and yet still philosophical, was a good move for him away from the sort of stuff he and Russell were doing early in the 20th century. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm in the history of philosophy. I sort of don't look at it that way, you know, the good guys versus the bad, who I like and who I don't, because I guess if I think they're good, if they're a philosopher that qualifies in my mind as a philosopher, there's something worth exploring there. I do know that I probably am less attracted to the 19th century than most other centuries in philosophy, so I really don't have a lot of attraction for Hegel or even John Stuart Mill for that matter, even though there's things about their thought that I've learned over the years I might even agree with. So the 19th century, I don't know, to me seemed to take philosophy down a notch, and I was trying to reflect on why I think that, and it may be because starting with Descartes and then Kant, the connection between philosophy and reality, that tether had been cut, and so philosophy was sort of floating on its own, talking to itself and its own issues, and not really trying to be a part of the world we actually live in, a kind of separate discipline. And I think that starts there and continues into the 20th century, which in many cases, in my mind, is a kind of scholastic age where we really just talk to other philosophers the whole time, and we really don't care too much about how it affects or is part of the world that people actually live in. It might be a bit unfair in Mill's case, but you know, with Mill, I find movement in so many directions for so many reasons. It's never clear to me what he's getting at, other than, again, worrying about the last theory he had or the last theory he read. And I mean, the guy was so well read and so knowledgeable and so smart. Maybe that just is what's going to happen to you if you're like that. I don't know, but. Again, I get the feeling after a while when you look at his whole corpus that he's just all over the map and really isn't very well focused into to anything. So that may be an unfair characterization, but that's sort of my impression, if you will. It's a hard. I still think trying to get to the basis of the nature of ethics, what ethics really is as a subject matter, what it's predicated upon, what grounds it, what it means, are still questions in our mind that Doug Rasmussen and I are still grappling with in various ways, trying to get a handle on some things that we've done in the past and moving them into other areas. So that's important. To me, I think those are tough issues. I suppose, in general terms, too, the relationship between theory and practice has occupied some of my attention and our attention. And the role of philosophy in the world, I think, is another version of that same question, because we do live in times that people are, again, talking about sort of perennial big issue kinds of things because the world isn't going quite right or something like that, and that raises the question of the relationship between theory and practice to me. Well, of course, one way to answer that question is that the most challenging criticism is the one we tried to meet, namely that liberalism is an amoral political theory which is not interested in ethical conduct, but is more interested in the creation of benefits or wealth without any connection to the ethical. And I still think that's the view many people have. That's the view in part that Doug and I have been trying to combat. And I think it's still out there, so it still is a challenge in that sense. If you mean challenge in the sense that we don't have an answer for something, that of course could go to many things we talk about, right? I mean, I don't think either Doug or myself are so arrogant that we think we have all the answers, but I do think that this issue about what to do with this doctrine of liberalism in a time when it seems to be waning in its appeal or effect upon people, I think is a very serious issue for us. Well, in some ways, it's better than it was when I was in graduate school. I mean, we have more people who are writing. I used to believe when I was in grad school, it probably wasn't true, but I used to believe that I knew every classical liberal in the United States, and I know that's not the case now. There are plenty of people working on classical liberal topics, some young people coming up, and so forth. But I still think there are many challenges. The notion that when the Iron Curtain fell, liberalism was going to rise up to replace it as the predominant political philosophy has not turned out to be true. We have many things that I would regard as illiberal that are called liberalism that have come and tried to fill that gap, various forms of communitarianism and so forth that I would object to. That have risen to more prominence in recent years. I don't think socialism per se is quite as active as it was, but we have this kind of incremental social democrat type doctrines that have become more influential, I think, at least in the United States than they were in the past. Oddly enough, I think when you have a crisis in practice like we sort of do today, that the way to go is more pushing of the ideas rather than looking for some sort of practical solution to it. That to me the big danger is that when you try to be practical to meet a practical problem, you lose a sense of the ideas and the principles, and it makes things worse. So actually the kind of thing that you're doing, that we're doing, trying to talk about these ideas, get people to talk about them, get people to debate them and so forth, is, to me, a very important practical, if you will, step to do it. This is the time when it's needed more than ever. When things are going well, perhaps you need it somewhat less.